Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hey/X/. Just thought that I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone all hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mum went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just got too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high up I was. One day I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock. "Hey, kid." I was gripped by fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down but couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time I sat there in silence, and I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the man's voice at all. "I know you can hear me." Much louder this time, I yelled out something and scrambled up the log a bit higher. Trembling, I dug my fingernails into the bark and clung tight. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The bird song was softer and more cautious, and when I listened closely, I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all my imagination by leaning over as far as I possibly could without slipping right off the edge. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth. "Come down here or I'll come up and grab you." So loud it was as if it were being screamed in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was only saved by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. All I heard was the wind in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother in time, I somehow recovered, exhibiting that naive, hard skin of a child, although I never went as far in as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and bringing it back inside. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk when the air was brimming with mosquitoes. A swampy fog usually coated the lawn. By the time I made my last round, it would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my last favourite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you have ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, you will know how uncomfortable that she'd made me. One of these nights it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blurring. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, dropping all of the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. When I go to pick them up, foot throbbing, the ground is too misty to see my own knees. Screw this. I decided to head to the house. We got more than enough wood for one night. However, it's getting darker, and I can't make out any signifiers of which direction I'm heading in, even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mists. I couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even find the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles and mud under my feet instead of the lawn. After a while, I realized I couldn't even find the shed anymore, cursing myself for being so dumb, trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play. I realized I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mist walls all around me, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it there was an arrow pointing left. Looks vaguely like something my mum might make, I rationalise, to keep me from getting lost. So foolishly, I followed the direction set by that green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. Keep walking for about 5-10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breather. Heart is pounding so fast it's hurting. As I'm sitting down, I notice another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I notice that this one is embedded with a long nail. It bears another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppily written note, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convince myself that these notes are my only shot at getting unlost before nightfall. I'm desperate to get out and my brow is cold with sweat, so I follow the green arrow to a point where I can just dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point it's getting pretty dark, and I'm having to strain just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for trees, and terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had an arrow pointing up again, up a steep slope that I didn't recognise being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face above it. At this stage, I become too freaked out to cope, and start to cry there a little. As I slumped against the pine stump, the possibility that I would be out in these woods all night beginning to sink in, I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked fresh and without signs of decay despite the previous weeks of non-stop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood run cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time I stood there in the rolling fog, reading and rereading that horrible note, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint, blindly, twigs snagging my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note, in big green letters, was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck, like the breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and crawled into bed where I remained, unsleeping till morning. Mum just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, some freakish coincidence that I even found the house at all. The final incident at that house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things I had, although we mutually shared the weird, oppressive quality that the house's interior had, and its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living way out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from Mum in all caps. "Is this a prank I need to know immediately?" Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm herself is what a prank." Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m, when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and to not, by any means, dare go home. I remember torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and I was soaked when I finally got there. It was 2 towns away. I'd had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mum's disturbing messages were enough of a warning not to. When I get there, Mum and Grandma are having lunch. Mum seems composed, but she's totally white and shaky. At one point, she sends a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It's not until that night, when my grandma is asleep, that she tells me what happened. She forbids me from telling old Grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This was what happened the night I was at Amanda's. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while my mother became aware of, and vaguely irritated by, tiny thumping sounds near her head at the window. When she went to investigate, she saw fat brown moths of a kind we often got at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper, louder, that she paid more notice and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush, then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been. Momentarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then she jumped back from the window with a start as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her, my one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely stifled a scream seeing her daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move nor blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the bush, as they continued to do in a loud downpour. My face continued to press out at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence the later text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing behind the tree just started moving, as if it were making silent words really, really fast. Suddenly it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree, my mum said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start again. Then she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to the second story, to my bedroom, the only room with a working lock, where she locked herself in and sat at the end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against that window, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother did not feel safe. There is an awful smell in there and a weird humming noise in the walls. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen she caught the distinct sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In horror, she recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door where that awful white face was staring right at her, mouth contorting and gaping in what sounds like highly sped-up whispering. The closet door is only a meter from my mother. It starts to open slowly. She ran to the door immediately, fumbling with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards, before finally getting out, running out of the house completely, keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off. She said as she looked back, right at the end of the long, long drive, she looked up to my broken window, where she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at the window, watching as she drove off. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that house again. As my mother told this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her and still don't. I believe fully that she experienced what she says she did. It was also clear that we were done in that house for good. I only went back once with my dad, who I see very rarely. He came from another state to help us move. Mum had already found a place in town and moved in. Me and Dad just loaded up his truck with all that was left in the place. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There's only two things left worth mentioning. 1. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed and rocks were lying on the floor. 2. Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we'd had the swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the week since we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I'd stopped climbing many years ago. It was obviously new rope and a nicely polished, sanded-down wooden seat at the base. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, he doubted the affair and thought my mother was unstable, said a neighbour probably set it up, not realising it was on our property. Of course he knew as well as I did that we had no neighbours for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in all that space, and never in my time living there did I see any other signs of human habitation. But I let it go, and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to the place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I've found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it, though. It's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it, but for a long while I couldn't. Nowadays it only comes to mind when I'm lurking/x/. Seeing as it's Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma sold the house to a new family and a young couple and their little son shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about it altogether. I'm less anxious about it all, though sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. I can't help but think of the old house, the fallen down tree and the new occupants, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles obliviously towards it.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.